Hello and welcome to the webinar this afternoon on public sector bodies, accessibility regulations, procurement and checking external products are accessible. My name is Annie Mannion. I'm Digital Communications Manager at AbilityNet, and I'll be introducing today's webinar and running you through what you can expect from today's session. I'm joined today by Claire Gibbons, who is Project Manager for the Digital Team, Marketing and Communications at Leeds Trinity University, and also Abby James, who is Principal Accessibility and Usability Consultant at AbilityNet. Abby will be hosting the slide deck today. So Abby, if you don't mind, first slide, please. So just to go through a few bits of housekeeping before we start the content for today's session. We've got live captions on the webinar provided by My Clear Text. It's a live person running that. Hello, Kate. So we appreciate My Clear Text support. Slides and a transcript are available, so if you have any technical issues and you need to leave early, don't worry, there will be an automatic email sharing the recording and the slides. Depending on how you joined the webinar, there's a chat window and a Q&A window. So please use the chat window in the main for any queries or comments for us to address. There's a Q&A option as well, but we'll use that to ask questions to panelists at the end. If you want to ask the presenters any questions, to just drop those in the Q&A area for us to address later on. And then we also have a feedback page you'll be directed to, which invites you to tell us about any future topics you'd like us to cover. If there's anything you'd like us to speak about, please do use that opportunity to let us know. And next slide, please, Abby. And just for any of you who aren't yet familiar with AbilityNet, we support people of any age living with any disability or impairment to use technology to achieve their goals at home, at work and in education. And we do this by providing specialist advice, services, free information resources. I'll share a little more about our services at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please, Abby. So just before we get stuck into the actual content, here's a quick overview of what we'll be covering. The overall focus is on how you can ensure you procure accessible solutions for your needs from external suppliers. Claire Gibbons will share Leeds Trinity University's approach to ensuring accessible websites, documents and services. And Abby will provide some information on the latest news, new resources and approaches to digital accessibility within the public sector. There's also an opportunity for questions at the end, mainly focused on procuring accessible products and services. Can I just check, can everybody see the slides on screen? And if not, please raise your hand, let us know via the chat pane. My colleagues Mark and Alice will be helping to answer any queries we have coming through. Yeah, okay, great. So I'm just going to introduce the first poll, as we'd like to find out a bit more about you all and your levels of involvement in the topic. So it's really just to gauge who we have joining us and your reasons for attending. So if you could just tell us, let me just launch the poll. Okay, you should be able to see the poll there. So if you could just tell us, what's your main reason for attending today's webinar? Is it that you work at a university and want to ensure accessible procurement, you supply products and services and want to ensure accessibility of your clients, you work at a public sector organisation and are responsible for ensuring accessible products, or you work at a digital agency and are interested in accessibility, or anything else? If you can just share those details in the chat pane, that would be great. I'll just give everybody a chance to answer the poll. Depending on how you've joined the webinar, you may find that you can't see the poll, but you can respond in the chat panel. So I can see 77% have voted so far. So last few seconds for anyone that can see the poll on screen and wants to engage. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. Okay, we can see that the majority of people on the webinar today work at a university and want to ensure accessible procurement. That's 61% of you. And then next is you work at a public sector organisation and are responsible for ensuring accessible products. That's 21% of you. And then you supply products or services and want to ensure accessibility for your clients, it's 10%. And we've got a few people from digital agencies and then a few other responses. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the poll now, and I'm going to hand over to our first presenter, who's Claire Gibbons, and she's going to talk about accessible procurement at Leeds Trinity University. So over to you, Claire, if you can move the first slide, please, Abby.
So yeah, hi everyone, thanks for the introduction. I am Claire Gibbons, as mentioned, and I've been working with Leeds Trinity University for the last 18 months on a website redevelopment programme of work. I've got around 12 to 13 minutes to talk you through the different strands of the project that are on the screen at the minute, and how we embedded accessibility into each strand, starting with the procurement of 2 separate systems. It was good to see from the poll so many people from universities, because I think it's really high profile with universities at the moment, and I think we're all learning together, so hopefully some of the experiences we've had might feed into kind of some of the processes you're going through at the moment. There has been a lot of learning along the way. We are still learning, but as I said, hopefully we can show you how you can procure accessible systems. It's about having a good plan and a considered approach from accessibility from the start. So the work to be done was originally classed as a website redevelopment project, but it was actually so much more than that in the end. And so I used the term programme of work throughout the communications to staff, student and external stakeholders. The old website, which as of last week is no longer there, was developed in SharePoint. And so part of the work was to procure a new publishing platform and evolve the publishing processes across the university, as well as update the search solution to one that actually worked. So we had a tender and procurement process right at the start, which some of you will know are really time consuming and somewhat grueling, but I'll talk more about those in a moment. That's kind of the meat of the presentation. We also needed to evolve the skill set of the central digital team through the recruitment of a new web developer. From the start, we wanted to co-create a digital pattern library with an external agency. These are getting more popular amongst higher education, and that in itself could be a different presentation for another time. So there was another tender and procurement process there, as well as months of working together to design and develop the different building blocks of the new website. So we are ensuring that the quality of the new site remains and further improves through the development and publication of an online service manual. And we're going to start up a web community of practice for those colleagues across the university who are involved with creating and publishing content for the new website. So there was a lot to be done, as you can see, but we did start off with the procurement process, which we kicked off back in November 2018. Next slide, please, Abby. So going back to the full programme of work, I've tried to theme the activities together, and I've kind of labelled them as procurement, people, and processes. Everybody likes a PPP. So I'm a big believer in sound digital governance and processes, and that's a whole different webinar in itself, another one. But I wanted to make sure that things were done well and to a high standard, and that accessibility was embedded at every stage. As you can see, it's kind of almost an equal weighting in terms of the activities and the themes, which feels like a well-balanced programme of work. So procurement, people, and processes. Next slide, please, which I think might be a poll. Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to launch the poll. Okay. So do your existing procurement guidelines mention accessibility at all? We don't have procurement guidelines. We don't know. No, they don't. Or yes, we have procurement guidelines that mention accessibility. So just in case you joined the webinar late, depending on how you've joined, you may find you can't see the poll, but you can respond in the chat panel. So I'll just give a bit more time for everybody to vote. It's going up to 73%. A few more seconds for anyone else who wants to engage with the poll. Okay, I'm just going to end the poll now, so get the last votes in. Okay. So I'm just sharing the results. The majority of you aren't sure whether existing procurement guidelines mention accessibility at all, but a fair amount do have procurement guidelines that mention accessibility. So I don't know if you want to make any further comment on that, Claire.
I guess you might not know if you've never had to use them, so that's probably quite why there's quite a high volume there. I think it's good to see so many that do mention accessibility. So I think part of this webinar might be just familiarising yourself with your university policies and procedures, so that if you do come to any procurement in the future, you know what you're dealing with. But yeah, no, that was great to see. And I noticed something in the chat. The ones over 50k do, anything below that doesn't, which is what I'd like to change. I think that's great. Yeah, I think that does need to change. It should cover everything. So thank you, Jade, for that. Cool.
Okay. Okay.
So on to the next slide, I think. Fab. So yeah, as I mentioned, we started off with the invitation to tender for a web content management system, which was to replace the SharePoint setup that was in place. Now, this is a process that I'd been through before at a previous institution, and so understood how important it was to get the criteria right at the very start. So tip number one is to don't underestimate how long this will take. If you get it wrong at the requirement stage, you will not end up with a system that's fit for purpose, within your budget and accessible. This did take us weeks and weeks and weeks. We looked at other recent higher education tenders, some of which were completed, some of which were in progress or actually public, so you can see them. And we did speak to other universities who had gone through a similar process quite recently. I think whilst teams, skills and objectives may differ, there is always something to learn from others. So I'd like to say a massive thank you to Dundee, Worcester, York St John, the University of the Highlands and Islands, and anyone else we spoke to during that time. It was a hugely valuable exercise speaking to other people. So our CMS requirements document had around, I think it was 155 different requirements. So it was a very, very long spreadsheet that was very, very tricky to put together. But we grouped them together into 21 categories. And accessibility was first in that list, A, which is also for accessibility, but we wanted to put it first, not for that reason. So as you can see on the screen, we had 4 specific accessibility criterion that needed to be addressed. And we felt that this was really setting out our stall, both in terms of requiring a system that was accessible for all to use, as well as generating accessible content to be published within the realms of the training and so on that we need to give our publishers. The criteria and weighting that we worked so hard on really helped us to separate out the tenders that, as they were submitted and scored, which again is a really long process for anybody who's done it before. But we really do feel that we've procured the best system for Leeds Trinity. And we did a similar thing for the search solution, but you get the idea in terms of spending time on your requirements documents, speaking to other people. A lot of them are public anyway, especially if they go through the contracts finder on the Gov website, and I can send you ours if you're doing a similar procurement process. But yes, that's procuring our CMS. On to the next slide, please, Abby. So later on in the programme of work, it was time to get a digital agency on board, who we could work with to evolve the existing online look and feel based on the user research we had done earlier in the process. This all kicked off last summer. I seem to remember being absolutely boiling hot when we were doing this rebrand, not like it is today, but anyway. So again, a lot of the time was spent figuring out what we really needed an external agency to do, and what to work with us on, and how we wanted to work with us throughout the whole process. Something we did, which is quite unusual, and I could highly recommend actually, we did a pre-tender exercise where we invited a lot of agencies to chat to us in more detail about their work in this area. And this was incredibly time consuming again, but also incredibly beneficial in that we learned a lot from them. You know, we're not designers ourselves, so we learned a lot from them. It helped us develop our criteria in much more fine detail. And it also helped us to get a feel for the sorts of agencies that are out there and the work that they've done. It also helped us, again, to set our stall out in terms of what was important to us. And that was then later reflected in the specific criteria in our requirements doc. So throughout the pre-tender exercise, we engaged with 39 agencies altogether, which is a lot, either by email, phone or face-to-face, and that was within about a 3-week period. When the formal tender was announced, we received 11 formal tenders. So that's a big drop from 39 to 11, which actually made the scoring a lot quicker. And then we only invited 6 to present to us on campus. So again, the work we put in at the start, chatting to agencies, understanding the market, developing strict and specific criteria around accessibility and everything else, it was really worth it to get down to that smaller number of presentations and on-campus visits. And then we really found the best fit agency for us. So as you can see from the slide, there were 4 criteria which mentioned accessibility, and this was out of a set of 12. So if my math is correct, 30%, is that right? I think so, yeah. Again, showing the importance of accessibility and the need to get it right from the outset. So again, all the work was front-ended, which made the scoring and the actual choosing in the end quite quick. Next slide, please. So following on from the procurement of systems and an agency, we needed a new person, and this was in the shape of a new web developer. So as anyone who's ever recruited a new member of staff knows, the recruitment process starts again with a kind of a specification document, which is the job description and the person's spec. And getting this right, again, time consuming, but incredibly important. So whilst technical skills and experience are fundamental to this type of role, so is aptitude and attitude, and a sound understanding of user needs and the requirements to make our online services accessible to all. So it comes as no surprise to find out that specific accessibility related criteria was included in the person's spec against which people could apply, and then a question around accessibility was asked at interview. This was key in helping us separate out those who had heard of accessibility and could quote the latest legislation, and those who lived and breathed it and baked it into their work from the start. And again, we got a fabulous developer, and we couldn't have asked for better, so it worked. Next slide, please. So whilst not strictly to do with procurement, our project people have been key in terms of engaging with as many internal stakeholders as possible, but also spreading the word about accessibility more widely across the university, especially to those who hadn't really had to think about it before, who had maybe never even heard of it. So from the start, the project board were engaged with all the different procurement and recruitment processes, and therefore aware of the importance of accessibility at every stage of the programme of work. It helped to raise the importance of accessibility more generally across the institution, and became a topic of conversation where it possibly hadn't been before. I've just seen something in the chat about CMS. It stands for Content Management System. Yes, sorry, I shouldn't use acronyms. That's a very bad higher education thing. Sorry about that. So yes, that was the project board. I also ran open sessions for staff and students at key points throughout the 18 months. I think there were 4 or 5 altogether. Again, reinforcing the principal accessibility as part of these. And a lot of these people they could have been academics, support staff, professional services. And again, I've probably never heard of digital accessibility in this context. I ran monthly project team meetings, and these were made up of around 20 key reps from across the university whose input would be needed further down the line as part of ongoing business usual later. So they were the people who would be working with us on their content and then kind of being our web editors later on. About halfway through, each project team meeting was themed. It was more kind of learning together rather than kind of a boring project team meeting. And the idea was that everybody would learn together, be that about content creation, content marketing, content calendars, that kind of thing. And then halfway through, I ran one which I called an introduction to digital accessibility. I used lots of resources that are out there for everybody. The idea was to show colleagues how differently people can use and navigate through websites, and the importance of designing for all, for everybody from the start. You may have seen this video. It's a video about web accessibility from the Web Accessibility Initiative. And I also demonstrated some simulators, so people who might be colourblind, people who are short-sighted, people long-sighted, people who have tunnel vision, that kind of thing. And it was, for some staff, it was the first time that they had ever seen anybody use a website in a different way to them. So this was quite an easy and quick way to get a powerful message across. So yeah, do kind of use the resources that are out there that these experts in accessibility have already put together. Next slide, please. So processes. I mentioned earlier about my love of all things digital governance. So we have developed and are continuing to develop policies, procedures, guidelines, standards, and training as we go. And we are starting a web community of practice to embed digital governance across everyone and everything associated with creating content or publishing to the new website. And we'll meet possibly once a term, so that will be 3 times a year. We've got a set of website principles which embed usability and accessibility in everything we do, and an evolving suite of training courses which will enable all our new CMS users, content management system users, to create and write accessible and appropriate content for all. So something we have been working on is the reading age. On the old website, it was about 11, 12 on some pages and higher on the more academic pages. And we've currently brought that down to an average of 8. So we're really quite pleased with that. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to finish off really, here's a few takeaways to sum up. Accessibility can't be an add-on. It needs to be embedded from the start. And that includes working with your procurement teams to develop the best criteria you can for any procurement process. As I mentioned earlier, it is time consuming, but it's really worth it. It kind of puts the work at the start and speeds up the process at the end. Work with your colleagues to embed the idea of accessibility where you can. At Leeds Trinity, we are very much at the start of the accessibility journey institutionally, but we are learning together and supporting each other as we go. As we are doing today, learn from others outside of your organisation. For all those of you who work in higher education, there is what's called the HE Digital Slack workspace, for anyone who's familiar with Slack. It's an online community for web and digital teams in higher education, and as part of that we do have an accessibility channel which is quite lively, and there's info on the next slide how to join. And then JISC has various email lists which some of you may be on. That might be how you found out about today. But we can share those in any follow-up email. And do look out for events and webinars and things like this, and do share them with others in your institution. Whilst kind of digital accessibility might sit with a central team, it's kind of everybody's responsibility really. Next slide, please. And that's it. Feel free to get in touch if you'd like to find out more of what we've done. That's my email address. That's my Twitter. It's more about non-work than work, but anyway, you can get me on Twitter, and the kind of link to get into the HE Digital Slack community is there. It will trigger a message to one of the admins, and then they'll kind of just let you into the workspace community. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening. Next slide.
Great, thank you, Claire. That's really interesting to hear the Leeds Trinity experience and see how much it's changed over the last few years. So what was quite interesting reflecting on that whole session was we started off with lots of people saying, I don't know about procurement, and what Claire's explained is from the perspective of a project, how procuring that process and focusing on accessibility as a major part of it has made such a big difference to Leeds Trinity. In the second part of this webinar, excuse me. There we go, been talking lots today already. The second part of this webinar, I'm going to look more about how holistically, how we engage with procurement teams and how we engage with suppliers as well to ensure that accessibility does become embedded in day-to-day procurement activities. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A. I've already seen there's a couple of questions for Claire coming up to answer, and I'll also see what else I can add as we get to the end of the webinar session. So, my name's Abby James. I think many of you might have heard me speak again. I am a consultant, as Annie said, but I also have worked in the university sector and still engage with research as part of the University of Southampton. And where I'm going to start from with the public sector regulations is that we need to always think about why are we talking about procurement and suppliers. So now in the UK, we have these regulations, and they say from the UK guidance that for public sector organisations, you're legally responsible for your website meeting accessibility requirements, even if you've outsourced your website to a supplier. Now, what that often gets turned into when you engage as a supplier is you must meet WCAG 2.1 level AA. And actually, does that actually help the supplier or the client, the university or any other public sector, really procure a website or any systems that are meeting the regulations as a whole? I'm going to unpick a bit more about why that happens and why sometimes we actually need to understand more than this one line requirement. So I'm just going to ask Annie to start another poll, because I'd like to know if you are aware, if your procurement or if you're a supplier, your sales team, those that are engaging with procurement teams in public sector, have any accessibility expertise.
Okay. So does your procurement or sales team have any accessibility knowledge or expertise? Yes, a bit. We've provided guidance. No, not sure, or other. So again, please use the chat pane to provide more detail, and depending on how you've joined the webinar, you can respond in the chat panel. Nearly 70% have voted. Just a few more seconds to get your votes in. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. So the majority of you say not sure, and some have got a bit of guidance. Abby, I don't know if that's, does that tally with some of your experience?
Yeah, I think that tallies with experience, and it tallies with our first poll as well. And I think that is a reflection on the situation that's happened in higher education, where disability has been seen part of the disability services, and it's been a reasonable adjustment to students and learning support approach. And now we're having to say, actually, this needs to be part of everything we do within a university as part of inclusive teaching and learning, as well as now the digital accessibility regulations. So therefore, we need to actually embed this knowledge throughout new teams as well. So moving on. What sort of engagement might you have where procurement teams might be having to talk to suppliers about accessibility? And in particular, I wanted to reflect on who is responsible for accessibility, because it's all well and good going to a supplier and saying, you must now meet these regulations. But we need to think that that might vary in terms of who's responsible in terms of what you're buying. So these are three scenarios a university or public sector might be facing. You may be wanting to procure an off-the-shelf tool. So you just want to buy into a tool. That could be software as a service. That might be your library buying into some ebook provision, or it might be something like a booking platform, or it may be a HR system that's all online. And now that is all covered under the regulations because it might be part of your intranet service. You may not be customizing it, but because you've purchased it, you are still considered to be in control. You might be looking at something like Claire was talking about, a CMS platform, where you're going to buy a system, but you're going to probably do some customization with templates. You're going to set it up as you will, and you'll be populating it with content. Similarly, a virtual learning environment, VLE, or any intranet system is something that, though you buy it, you're then going to customize it to your system. Or again, another scenario that Claire talked about, which is a bespoke tool, engaging an agency to develop a new website, where you are going to work in collaboration to create something that is bespoke for you. Now, when we think about the accessibility and who's responsible to it, it does actually vary across those different types of purchasing processes. When it's an off-the-shelf tool that you're not going to do anything about, then what you see is what you get. WYSIWYG. It's, you are going to buy that tool, and it's going to be available through your website to your internal staff, students, but also potentially the wider public as well. And you must rely on the supplier making sure that that's accessible. But as soon as you start to do any customization, or if it's a bespoke tool, then you as the customer have a responsibility towards accessibility as well, because you might be making changes which then impact accessibility. And why this is really important to remember is that essentially by taking on a system from a third party, you are taking on the accessibility risk. And I wanted to talk about the language of accessibility risk, because this is something that procurement understand and legal people understand. Because what has happened with these public sector regulations is the risk of having an inaccessible system is placed on the public sector body, not on the people who make that system if it has come from the private sector. And there's been some interesting research in the US by an organisation called EduCause, which is similar to JISC. It's like a professional organisation, or ALT, Learning Professionals. And they did some work looking at risk assessments for accessibility, because there is quite a strong legal structure in the US around colleges and universities providing accessible systems. And they found 18 different risk statements for universities where legal action has been taken. And some of that legal action is also in the private sector or in government as well. And you can go to the link and you can find all of them. But there were two in there particularly which are significant for procurement. So the risk statement of failure to ensure IT obtained, provided or developed by third parties is accessible. And that is something where universities and colleges have been found to be lacking, to not meeting accessibility standards. And similarly, failure to implement a procedure which ensures that procuring IT is accessible, such as including accessibility requirements in RFPs, that's request and contractual language. So actually that's saying that it is still a risk if you don't even ask about accessibility. That could be something you could be found to be, that you haven't met the responsibilities of the procurement. I can see somebody said EIT, that's the language EduCause have used for IT. I think it's electric and information technology. But it's an interesting resource to go to. And as I said, we'll share the links after the session. And now the problem is that accessibility is addressed at different stages of a project. And this slide here shows you the most common problems we find with accessibility. And this is not just when we do our testing, this is recognised in other projects. There was an organisation called WebAIM that did a scan on 1 million sites last year. And again, these are the types of issues they found everywhere. So some of them are design related. So colours, colour contrast is always a big failure, lack of focus indicator, icons and layouts, and those templates that you then use across your whole site. That's where design influences accessibility, so it's really easy to introduce an accessibility issue that then impacts the whole of your site. From a development point of view, anything that requires interaction, forms, keyboard access, anything that requires responsive design, changing it from a desktop to a mobile view, that could have an impact on accessibility. And then when it comes to content, things like any images you put up, any videos you put up, and the languages you use, as Claire was saying, that can have an impact on accessibility. And if we think back to that previous slide of who is responsible for accessibility, often the content lies with the public sector body, the purchaser, not necessarily with the supplier. So I just wanted to go through a couple of examples that we've seen, and I've seen throughout 10 years I've been looking at web accessibility. But these are real life examples which can affect procurement processes. So often you see within universities and public sector organisations, they want e-learning platforms and they want to create accessible activities, interactive activities as part of their e-learning provision or part of assessment as well. And when you go and look at these tools and you look at accessibility, you will find statements like, yes, you can create courses that support WCAG, and that's a direct quote from a supplier. However, when you actually dig down into these types of tools, what you find is if you've got an activity such as drag and drop, which is something that as an instructor or a lecturer I want to use, that's quite a common activity. It's more interesting than just multiple choice, and it's more interesting than just filling in a text box. But actually, when you dig into the paperwork around this course, it actually says that for keyboard access, it only partially supports keyboard access because some activities such as drag and drop and videos in interactive exercises are not keyboard accessible. So while on the face of it, this solution says that they support WCAG, it's the you can create courses that's the important emphasis. They're saying it's up to you to ensure that you choose the options that will provide an accessible option. And actually with this framework, you have to be really careful about how you design your courses to make sure that they are accessible. Another example which we frequently come across, particularly at the moment with universities, is this design requirement about hero videos, background videos that are playing as you load your screen. The marketing people love them. you could go to a design agency and say, yes, we can develop a site that supports WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We can meet these new regulations. We know all about them. But then the marketing people and the design people say, background video, great way to grab attention, giving audio less continuous motion to the background of a particular section of content. And that's a direct quote from a marketing website saying why this design approach is really good for getting people to engage with your website. But then your accessibility people turn around and go, well, actually background videos cause lots of accessibility issues. And if we were looking at a site which had a background video playing when you loaded the page, we'd say, well, if there's any text overlaying it, you can have contrast issues because there's lots of different colours behind that text and it can be difficult to read. And anything that is moving has to have a pause button because that can cause problems for people who have motion sickness or can be easily distracted by that moving content. So it would fail at least one, if not two, accessibility guidelines. Now you've taken this requirement from a design perspective to your agency that says they're going to develop an accessible site, and they turn around and say, well, that means we've got to customize this off-the-shelf video component to add a pause button, and that's going to cost more. And who makes that decision? So this is where the client and supplier have to work together to decide about how much is accessibility important within the requirements of this website. That does the design argument win and say, well, actually, we're going to have that background video, but you're then going to have to make that statement or in your accessibility statement that that is an inaccessible component on your website, or are you willing to pay that extra amount of money and make sure that that background video is there, but it does meet accessibility standards. So it's not so easy as just saying to people, yes, we can meet WCAG standards and web accessibility standards, or yes, our system supports web accessibility standards. You always need to think about actually how much you value that within your procurement process. Now, there are some resources available. There's a really interesting article from the International Association of Accessibility Professionals that was published just a couple of weeks ago, and it was based on the state of Minnesota's requirements, and they have state law that requires they can't purchase anything that's not accessible. And they say these are the key things that you as a supplier need to do to ensure that we as a public sector buying your services can meet our legal responsibility. And they say you need to know exactly how your products and services support accessibility, and share that with us. Tell us if it doesn't meet accessibility. Share your accessibility roadmap as well. For example, I've talked to universities where they have, under the regulations, claimed disproportionate burden because they know that the next version of their VLE will meet the accessibility requirements. And that's fine, that's allowed, but because that knowledge of the roadmap has come through from their supplier, they are able to do that. Be honest, this was interesting. They scored those who identified flaws and plans for improvement for accessibility above those who claim conformance with no evidence. I think it's interesting. I've spoken to universities and I've spoken to big corporates who are looking at their procurement processes about accessibility, that if they don't get a detailed response, even if it's a one line saying, yes, we can make accessible systems, if they don't get detailed responses and telling you, yes, there are a few problems, this is what we're working on, then they are not confident that that supplier can provide an accessible system. Create an accessibility policy. So if you are developing systems and services for the public sector or anybody who's interested in accessibility, have a policy within your organisation. Show that your staff and your customers that you care about accessibility as well. To look for those organisations who are willing to claim and talk about how they embed accessibility within their development processes, within their recruitment processes as well, because then you know that they really understand what you're asking for as a customer. And develop processes and procedures that support that policy. And finally, look for organisations that have diverse workforces and hire people with disabilities, because then you know that they really understand the requirements around making digital systems and platforms accessible, and they're able to use that knowledge and experience to ensure that their testing processes and everything they are creating for you and for your students and staff does meet accessibility requirements. So one of the big questions I get quite often is, what information should we be asking from suppliers? And from suppliers, well, what should I be doing? Now, if you've been in an accessibility in these situations, then VPATs get bounced around. That's an acronym for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, which is a US document that's been provided for suppliers to fill in to demonstrate their accessibility. The problem with the VPAT is it's a very high level summary of accessibility compliance. So if I just skip back up to my example here, this box here where it says 2.1.1, this is an exact quote from the VPAT for this course level. So actually, yes, it did tell me that my one activity was not accessible, but I had to, it's still quite high level. It doesn't tell me whether I can create that activity to be keyboard accessible. So let me just skip back again. So VPATs are useful. The other thing to be aware of with VPATs is there are different versions of VPATs. The most recent 2019 version are aligned to WCAG 2.0, or there is, that's for the US version, so that's the VPAT 508 it's called. You can request one that's WCAG WCGAG WCAG 2.1, which is what we need for the regulations. And there also is a version for the European standard EN 301549, and there's a link again in the slides to the EU version. So that is the type of VPAT you should be looking for. You should be asking for the European standard or the WCAG 2.1 standard, and that gives you a high level summary. If there's information missing from it, if it's quite basic, then ask for more information. That's really important. Another thing to look at is look for suppliers who have developed and created accessibility statements which are in line with the public sector regulations. Look at how they show if there's any customizations which will impact accessibility, and then align that to what you're procuring to make sure that what you want to do, as Claire described, all those different requirements they had, I'm looking at my notes, over 100 requirements for their CMS system. Is there any in there that will not be met if you are trying to meet accessibility standards? The other thing is ask if they've had any external audits on their tools, or ask for example content. It's very quick and easy to do tab checks, just going through with a keyboard, looking using automatic checkers, just actually doing some basic accessibility testing on something the supplier's given you as an example, and ask about accessibility policies and their roadmap. Yes, you're not compliant at the moment, but what do you plan to do to meet accessibility in the future? Are you taking this seriously is the big question. Some other advice to suppliers: understand the digital accessibility regulations and accessibility statement requirements. If you're not aware about this, this is something that gives you a good advantage in selling situations as well. Make sure you have those conversations with clients and customers. So this is from both people purchasing, public sector, and the suppliers. Who is going to be liable if the client, the public sector, wants to include inaccessible requirements? So if you really want to use a template where the colour contrast is not going to meet accessibility requirements, who is making that decision and signing it off? And who is responsible for any costs of additional testing or additional development that is due to accessibility? So for example, you could have a client who said in the RFP, they want to make their site accessible, but then if you build that into the costings when you're saying how much it's going to cost, are they really going to value that and understand that they're willing to pay for how much accessibility may cost you? And also communicate your skills and expertise by measuring your accessibility maturity. So think about who in your organisation knows about accessibility. Are you willing to have these conversations? As Claire explained within the recruitment process, when you're talking to developers, you need to have more than just an understanding of what web page to go to. From purchasers, so from universities and public statements, there is part of the European standard EN 301549 that has functional statements, which says the website must work with somebody with low vision, with no vision, with hearing, with no hearing, and so on. And those are useful functional statements to include in any requests or tenders that you're doing to suppliers. So that will actually say this is what functionally you expect, as well as technical compliance with the web accessibility guidelines. So that you can ask them to then demonstrate how it meets those functional statements. It's important that all staff making purchasing decisions understand basic accessibility requirements using resources like Claire shared. Do they really understand how screen reader users may interact with the website, or how somebody who can't use a mouse may use it? Do they understand if they're purchasing something that's got lots of video content, how captioning might be important? Ensure you have some way of evaluating key functionality, and establish a robust scoring process for measuring accessibility risk. If you come down to those decisions where your supplier suddenly turns around and says, well, actually that's going to cost more for accessibility, how are you going to score that through the process? I know organisations that have done lots of testing and has lots of these processes in place for measuring accessibility during procurement processes, but the scoring system they use is so weighted to other categories and components that they often end up with the least accessible solution because other measures have outweighed them. And if you are after any accessibility and resources, there's the Lexis site, which has got a digital accessibility toolkit on there, and there's an accessibility and procurement section, which was developed and provided by Kent County Council, and that's got templates and resources on there that you can use to see how it is possible to build accessibility into the procurement state. And with about 10 minutes to go, I think with a bit of a rush through, but we've got some time left for questions.
Yeah, great. I'm sure you've all got a lot of questions you'd like to ask. So thank you very much to Abby and Claire for both of your presentations. There's lots of questions that have come through so far, but do feel free to add your questions to the Q&A window, and anything that we're not able to cover during the webinar, we'll be sharing a follow-up blog with answers soon. And again, there's a feedback form, so please do let us know in the comments about any future topics you'd like us to cover. So just moving on to some of the questions that have come through. We've got one from Tony to Claire. How do you measure the reading age level for the website? What tool do you use, or is that a feature that's built into your CMS?
Ah, cool. So there's a couple that we've got at Leeds Trinity. So we've got Funnelback, which is actually the new search solution. So Funnelback's got its own tool within that. There's also something called Site Improve, which higher education digital teams may know about. It's kind of a web suite of tools, and that checks things like SEO, analytics, and content quality. And there is something else that's completely gone out of my mind, so we'll add it to the email. But we've got those two systems in-house, Funnelback and Site Improve. But I'm sure that there is a more open kind of online tool, but I'll put that in the email. Yeah.
Okay, and we had a question through that was answered within the Q&As earlier, which was which CMS did you procure in the end, Claire, just to share with everybody else?
Yeah, sorry, I answered it privately. I didn't realise what I needed to do. Yeah, we got Terminal 4.
And there's a question for Abby that came through. When tendering for software solutions, what are some of the useful accessibility questions to ask bidders in an ITT?
So the useful questions are to ask are, do they meet accessibility standards? Then how do they evaluate that they meet accessibility standards, or how far do they meet it? So actually not just getting a yes/no decision, but actually how do they evaluate it? And then looking at critical functions as well. Are you able to use your software with keyboard? Are you able to use it on a mobile phone in a reflow situation? So those are things that I would be asking. I'd also be asking for any plans and improvements around accessibility, and then also about their knowledge and testing that they do, whether it is in-house or whether it is external audited. It can be both, but it's really looking at whether they have that robust practices in place and knowledge and experience as well.
Okay. And another question for Claire, this is from Kieran. When tackling accessibility problems, he's aware of what they need to fix on their site, but it's difficult to convey this to others who don't understand. He's looking for a checklist that explains things in a simple way. Do you have any suggestions about where he might be able to find that?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it is a case of somehow, maybe this could be a sector thing that we work on together, kind of simplifying the WCAG 2.1 standard into something that is more of a checklist. But I do think that showing something like the Web Accessibility Initiative Introduction to Digital Accessibility video, to actually show people higher up than yourself possibly, or people who you work with, why it's important and how it's actually the risk of not doing it, that your website just won't be usable to most people. Basically, an accessible website is a usable website for everybody. So I can't think of a checklist off the top of my head, but it might be something that as a sector we can work towards, and also have like a top 10, a top 20, a top 50, depending on where you are in your journey. But there's certainly some quick wins that you can do, things like alt text, your header hierarchies, titles, that kind of thing, that I really should be doing anyway. But I think it might be something we could work together as a sector. That might be a good discussion for over on the HE digital Slack workspace, perhaps. There's also a document we can share in the links afterwards that we've got, we put together for a previous webinar and training. It's on the Lexis site, which has 18 tests that cover 30 success criteria, and you don't need any particular development knowledge, so they're aimed at managers and project managers as well, so you can go through and actually do those quick tests as well. And the Gov UK site have a primer for WCAG that they use for internal testing, so whereas WCAG is written in a way that's quite difficult to understand testing language, theirs is, does it do this, does it do that, yes, no questions. So that's also a useful tool to look at, and we'll send that link. Okay. Yeah, I just remembered that actually, and I think that they are developing that to go out further, because they did do some preliminary beta testing. They actually came to visit Leeds Trinity last year, and it was to go through the, does your website do this, does it do that? But I don't think that's been published yet, but that must be what that is, Abby. It must be a kind of an evolution of their internal processes, which would be brilliant once that's published, because that would be ideal.
Great. And another question for Abby from Tom. What do we do if a supplier doesn't engage at all, especially if it's viewed by academic staff as an essential resource for their teaching?
So this is the point from a point of view of you've taken on that accessibility risk. So you need to be clear that the accessibility standard of it in your statement. You need to consider whether you can claim disproportionate burden within the structure of the regulations, and that can be that there is no alternative. So for example, if you're using industry standard tools, because that's part of the requirement of the curriculum, and there is no alternative that must be used, then that could be a case for disproportionate burden. But there does need to be that conversation of the people making decisions from procurement, even if it is small individual academics choosing a system that they understand that then is bringing in legal speak, a liability to the university, and they need to be able to justify that. So it's about having that conversation, and often people just haven't even thought about it and are not aware about it. So starting from that point.
Okay, and another one for Claire. How has your procurement, this is from Richard, how has your procurement experience influenced the way that other systems are procured and developed at your institution? Is there a common approach being established, i.e. a culture of incorporating accessibility and usability concerns in procurement decision-making and ongoing systems development?
I think it's getting there. Yeah, so recently the university's done a similar process for a learning analytics system. And I worked really closely with that project manager, shared our accessibility criteria with her. She was putting together the invitation to tender documentation and the requirements document. So I think it is about sharing and being open in what you've done. And it is about speaking to people and making them aware of what you've done. I think that's why things like open sessions about a project that you're doing to people who might not think they'll be interested in it, but they just might remember, and a kind of little nugget of going, oh, I'm sure somebody's done something similar to that. And then that's where that conversation came from. So yeah, it was written into that criteria with the procurement team. So yeah, I think it's beginning to grow and being embedded, whereas possibly it wasn't before. So yeah, it's getting there. Yeah.
Okay. And a question from Jade, for both of you, you may be aware of, you mentioned US examples of lawsuits, but are there any from the UK that you know of?
So legally in the UK, it's a very different situation, and many of the examples in the private sector get settled out of court. I think the situation in the UK now with the public sector regulations is one of the sort of monitoring that will come in around the regulations, and Gov UK and GDS are starting that now as we speak this spring, and the potential reputational risk that's associated with that. And then yes, you know, we're having to be public and open about this, and as one of our collaborators, Alistair McNaught, says that by having to say that you have inaccessible systems, if you have a student or staff member who has a grievance, who feels that there hasn't been suitable reasonable adjustments, they have a clear track from an accessibility statement that doesn't say that something's inaccessible, so that information is not being provided, or that it hasn't been addressed and thought of if they were to take that further. That's always been the problem with digital platforms, is how do you prove that there was a barrier beyond you really going through that accessibility testing of a system at that moment in time when somebody had a problem. So there is that you know, potential now that people, because this information has to be made public. But in terms of the university sector as well, there's the Office of Students who are also looking at support for disabled students as well. So while we're not necessarily seeing it go down the litigious atmosphere and environment that's developed in the US, although a lot of that is around the government taking the role with universities and saying, no, you're not doing it correctly. We do see that this will be monitored and discussed and much more openly and transparent in the future, and that could evolve into not necessarily legal risk, but reputational risk and compliance risk within the university sector framework.
Okay, I'm just looking at the time, and I think we're going to end the webinar there. We've had loads of questions through, so we will try and address all of them in a follow-up blog. So if you have a question that hasn't been covered, just send it over and we'll do our best to answer it. Abby, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide. Just want to share a bit more information that might be of interest to you. AbilityNet's got a range of services, including fact sheets, blogs on our helpline. We run workplace assessments and accessibility testing, and we've also just launched a document remediation service. So do take a look at our website for further information on that. You can also sign up to our newsletter for the latest announcements about accessibility. And then if you could move to the next slide. And we'll be sharing more information soon about our next set of online training sessions on accessibility. So find out more at abilitynet.org.uk/training. For anyone who is attending the webinar today, we've got a discount code for 10% off the training sessions, which is Procurement 10. So do take a look at that when we announce further sessions. We've got dedicated services for those of you in higher and further education. You can see more information about that on our website. And finally, our next free AbilityNet webinar is coming up on the 31st of March and covers technology help for stroke survivors and their carers. So we look forward to catching up with you then. So thanks again to Claire and Abby and everyone that's joined us. And thank you for taking the time out of your day, and we'll be in touch with you soon. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.